They made her crawl. That was the intent. In the mud, stripped of dignity. But she would show them what it meant to be truly bare. The four Marines thought it was a game of power. They would learn in seconds about the power they could not see. Everything depended on her silence, on their underestimation. A ghost was walking among them, and they were about to try and put her in the ground. No one knew who she truly was, but that was about to change. She arrived at Camp Kestrel when the wind was at its most spiteful, a blade of sand and ice scouring the high desert. Alara stepped out of the transport vehicle, a single duffel bag in her hand, her presence as quiet and unassuming as the gray sky overhead. The base was a study in brutal architecture, concrete blocks and razor wire squatting in the dust, a place designed to break men down and rebuild them into weapons. To the handful of Marines who glanced her way, she was an anomaly, a disruption in the harsh rhythm of their world. They saw a woman of indeterminate age, her face a canvas of calm that seemed out of place amidst the ambient aggression. Her government-issued jacket was plain, her posture straight, but not military rigid. She was an observer, a liaison from headquarters, a bureaucratic ghost sent to tick a box. They dismissed her before she even set her bag down. The air was thick with testosterone and a low-grade contempt for anything that didn't carry a rifle and a swagger. Alara felt their eyes on her, cataloging, judging, and discarding. She had been counting on it. She walked toward the administrative building, her steps even and measured, each one a silent declaration in a language they had long forgotten how to read. This place was a crucible designed to forge an elite new unit for asymmetrical warfare. She was here to see if the fire was hot enough, or if it had been co-opted by the very arrogance it was meant to burn away. Colonel Madsen did not get up when she entered his office. He was a man carved from the same rock as the mountains that ringed the base, his face a relief map of old certainties and ingrained authority. He gestured to a hardback chair, his eyes scanning the single-page file on his desk. Her file. It was a masterpiece of omission, all sterile data and no substance. Alara, he said, the name sounding foreign and soft in the Spartan room. Headquarters sent you to observe. It wasn't a question, it was an accusation. With all due respect, this is the final selection phase for Tier 1 candidates. We are not a spectator sport. This is a forge. It's hot, it's dirty, and it is no place for a liaison. His tone was paternalistic, a carefully calibrated performance of professional concern that barely masked his deep-seated skepticism. He saw a woman, a civilian contractor by the looks of her papers, and concluded she was a liability. Another pointless oversight initiative from a command structure that understood less and less about the realities on the ground. Alara met his gaze without flinching. "I'm here to assess the program's integrity, Colonel," she said, her voice low and even, betraying no reaction to his condescension. "To ensure the criteria are being met," Madsen gave a short, humorless laugh. "The criteria are simple. Survival. We break them to see who is unbreakable. I'm not sure that's something you can assess from a clipboard." He leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk, a barricade of rank and experience. "Stay out of the way. Watch from the towers. Don't interfere with my instructors. Am I clear?" Alara simply nodded. "Perfectly." He dismissed her with a wave of his hand, already turning back to his real work. He had filed her away as an inconvenience, a problem to be managed, not a force to be reckoned with. It was an old, familiar mistake. For 3 days, she did as she was told. She watched. From the observation towers, from the periphery of the training grounds, she became a silent fixture against the horizon. She saw the candidates pushed beyond exhaustion, their bodies failing but their wills holding on by a thread. She watched the instructors, a cadre of elite combat veterans led by a gunnery sergeant named Croft. Croft was the epitome of the program's intended product. Physically dominant, psychologically unyielding, and radiating an aura of lethal confidence. But Alara saw something else in him, too. A cruelty that bordered on the sadistic, a pleasure in the breaking that overshadowed the purpose of rebuilding. Her focus kept returning to the centerpiece of the obstacle course, a brutal stretch of mud and wire they called the Serpent's Coil. It was a grueling, claustrophobic crawl through thick, freezing mud under barbed wire, designed to simulate the worst conditions of infiltration. It was more a psychological weapon than a physical test. As she watched Croft put the candidates through the coil, her hand unconsciously went to her wrist. Beneath the strap of her watch, hidden from view, was a faint, silvery tattoo. It was an Ouroboros, a serpent swallowing its own tail, the ancient symbol of cycles, of eternal return. She knew this course. She knew every inch of its unforgiving mud. She had designed it. She had bled in it. She had been born in it. And she was watching it being corrupted. The serpent was eating itself, not out of renewal, but out of a poisoned ego. Croft was using her creation not to find the unbreakable, but to feed his own sense of power. The pressure snapped on the fourth day. The air was colder, the mud in the serpent's coil thick as tar. A young candidate, his body trembling with hypothermia and exhaustion, faltered midway through the crawl. Croft descended on him like a hawk, his voice a serrated edge of contempt. "You want to quit? You want to go home to your mommy?" He dragged the candidate out of the mud and threw him to the ground. "This unit is for warriors, not children." To make his point, to broadcast the price of failure to the others, Croft ordered the boy to strip down to his shorts. "You want to feel the cold? Let's feel the cold. You will crawl it again, and you will thank me for the lesson." The act was pure humiliation, a stripping of dignity meant to shatter the man's psyche. One of the other candidates, a corporal with more courage than sense, spoke up. "Gunny, that's enough." Croft's head snapped toward him. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face. "Is it? You think so?" He pointed to the corporal and two of his friends. "Fine, you can join him." Then his eyes scanned the training area and landed on Alara, standing by the edge of the course, her expression unreadable. She was the symbol of the soft, interfering bureaucracy he despised. This was his chance to send a message back to whatever desk she came from. "And you, ma'am," he called out, his voice dripping with mock deference. "Our observer. You've been watching us work so hard. Why don't you show these boys how it's done?" A demonstration of proper form. The challenge hung in the air, thick and ugly. He and three of his instructors began to walk toward her, their movements casual, but their intent clear. They were corralling her, a pack of wolves closing in. "Come on, ma'am," Croft sneered. "Just a quick crawl. We'll even let you keep your shirt on." The implication was vile, a threat wrapped in a joke. They were going to force her into the mud, to debase her, to prove that their world had no place for her. They intended to make her crawl, to strip her bare before the eyes of everyone on that base. Alara did not speak. She did not argue or protest. Arguing with men like Croft was like reasoning with a storm. You could only endure it or redirect it. She looked at the four instructors fanning out to surround her. Croft, a barrel-chested brute. Two others, lean and hungry-looking, their knuckles scarred. The fourth, a younger man, his eyes alight with the vicious thrill of the pack. They believed they held all the power. They saw a woman in a jacket, a paper pusher. They were about to make a profound tactical error. Without a word, she unzipped her jacket and let it fall to the dusty ground. She bent down and unlaced her boots, placing them neatly beside the jacket. She stood before them in a thin, long-sleeved shirt and trousers, vulnerable to the wind and their leering eyes. This was the moment they expected fear, or tears, or a desperate plea. She gave him nothing but stillness. Croft smirked, victorious. "That's the spirit." He reached out to grab her arm, to escort her to the mud pit. His fingers clamped down on her forearm, and in that instant, the world shifted on its axis. The moment his skin touched hers, the quiet observer vanished. In her place stood something ancient and lethal. With a movement too fluid to track, she rotated her wrist, breaking his grip with a sickening pop of cartilage. She didn't pull away. She moved in, using his own forward momentum to unbalance him. Her left hand shot out, the rigid tips of her fingers striking the pressure point cluster below his ear. Croft's eyes went wide with shock, his nervous system screaming, and he collapsed like a marionette with its strings cut. The entire sequence took less than a second. The other three were frozen in disbelief. The first one to react lunged forward. Alara pivoted, her leg sweeping his feet out from under him. As he fell, her elbow dropped with pinpoint precision onto his collarbone. A crack echoed in the sudden, dead silence. The third man pulled a combat knife, a catastrophic mistake. She flowed under his clumsy slash, her palm striking the inside of his wrist, sending the knife spinning into the air. Her other hand cupped the back of his head, slamming his face into her rising knee. He dropped, unconscious before he hit the ground. The last one, the young one, just stood there, paralyzed by a terror he had never known. Alara took one step toward him. She didn't raise her hands. She just looked at him. He saw something in her eyes. Not anger, not rage, but an absolute, bottomless emptiness, a void that had swallowed armies. He scrambled backward, tripped, and fell into the mud he had been so eager to see her in. It was over. 4 elite Marine combat instructors, disabled in less than 5 seconds. Alara stood in the center of the quiet chaos, her breathing even, her expression unchanged. She was a statue in the eye of a hurricane she had created, and the entire base had fallen silent around her. The wind itself seemed to hold its breath. Every candidate, every officer, every person on that training ground was frozen, trying to process the impossible thing they had just witnessed. Colonel Madsen, watching through binoculars from his office window, slowly lowered them, his mouth slightly agape. The image was burned into his mind. The fluid economy of motion, the brutal, surgical efficiency. It wasn't a brawl. It was an equation being solved. He had seen bar fights and battlefield takedowns. This was neither. This was something else entirely, something he had only read about in classified after-action reports from the darkest corners of the globe. Down on the field, the silence was finally broken by a single whispered word. A young corporal, a former communications technician, was staring at Alara, his face pale. He had spent 2 years of his life reviewing encrypted intelligence feeds, watching grainy drone footage of ghost operatives moving through hostile territory. He had seen that specific sequence of movements once before, the finger strike to the vagus nerve, the unique wristlock reversal. It was the signature of a legend, a phantom spoken of in hushed tones in secure communication centers. A ghost who supposedly died in the Hindu Kush. He licked his dry lips and whispered the name, the call sign he had once heard an encrypted voice attribute to those movements. Spectre, he breathed. The name was a ghost itself, drifting through the stunned crowd, a wisp of smoke that carried the weight of 100 untold stories. The myth had just walked out of the shadows and broken 4 men in the broad daylight. The perception of Alara, the soft liaison, shattered into 1,000,000 pieces. In its place was a terrifying, awe-inspiring question. Who in the hell was she? Madsen called off all training for the day. The base was locked in a state of quiet shock. The 4 instructors were taken to the infirmary, one with a dislocated shoulder, one with a shattered clavicle, another with a severe concussion and broken nose. Croft had suffered temporary nerve paralysis in his neck and couldn't speak, a fitting irony. That evening, as if the day's events weren't enough, a real crisis erupted. The base's central command and control system, a highly complex and custom-built network that was the brain for a simulated hostage rescue. The final test for the candidates crashed. The system, codenamed Cerberus, went dark. Red lights blinked on a black screen. The base's top technicians swarmed the server room, their faces tight with anxiety. They ran diagnostics. They rebooted servers. They cursed at lines of code. Nothing. It was a catastrophic failure, a ghost in the machine they couldn't find. For hours they worked, their confidence eroding with every failed attempt. The system was more than just a training tool. It was a prototype for a new generation of battlefield networks, and it was dead in the water. Madsen, his mind still reeling from the events at the Serpent's Coil, found himself at a dead end. His best people were failing. His multi-million-dollar system was a brick. And then a thought, born of desperation and a new, profound curiosity, struck him. He sent a runner to find Alara. She was in the Spartan visitors' quarters, cleaning the mud from her trousers. When a young Marine arrived, breathless, he didn't deliver an order. He relayed a request. "Ma'am, the colonel asks if you would come to the command center." When she arrived, the tension in the room was a physical force. Technicians huddled around consoles, their faces illuminated by the glow of error messages. Matson met her at the door. "Our system is down," he said, his voice stripped of its earlier arrogance. It was a simple statement of fact. There was no condescension now, only a raw, unspoken plea. "Can you help?" Alara walked past him without a word. She didn't look at the frantic technicians. She walked to the main Cerberus schematic projected on the wall, a dizzying web of connections and data pathways. She studied it for no more than 30 seconds. Then she turned, went to the primary server rack, and pulled out a small toolkit from her pocket that no one had seen her carry. Her hands moved with the same impossible grace and certainty they had displayed on the training field. She didn't run diagnostics. She bypassed them. She opened a maintenance panel the technicians had overlooked, her fingers finding a loose fiber optic relay hidden deep within the chassis. It wasn't just loose. It had been subtly sabotaged, a deliberate flaw in the design to test for this exact kind of deep system failure. A test within a test. She reseated the connection, rerouted a power conduit, and then, moving to a keyboard, typed a string of command line code, so fast her fingers were a blur. It wasn't a fix. It was a surgical override of the system's core programming. She wasn't just repairing it. She was commanding it. While Alara worked, a storm of another kind was brewing on Colonel Madson's desk. Shaken by the day's events and faced with a cascade of failures, he had done the unthinkable. He had used his highest priority channel to send an urgent query to the Joint Chiefs, specifically to General Thorne, a man whose name was a legend in the special operations community. Madsen had requested the unredacted file for the observer, known only as Alara. His own clearance wasn't high enough to access it, and he knew he was risking his career by asking. But he had to know who he was dealing with. Minutes after Alara began her work on Cerberus, a reply came. It wasn't an email. It was a self-deleting, encrypted data packet. Madsen's computer chimed once. He entered his credentials, and the file decrypted on his screen. His blood ran cold. It wasn't a service record. It was a eulogy, a ghost story written in the black ink of classified operations. Alara was not her name. It was an alias. Her true identity was buried under layers of national security. Her call sign was Spectre, and according to this file, she had been declared killed in action 3 years prior during a black op in the Zagros Mountains. The file detailed her career. She was not just an operative, she was an architect. She was one of the original designers of the Tier 1 program he was now commanding. She wrote the book on psychological resilience, developed the unconventional warfare tactics, and she had personally overseen the construction of the prototype for the very command system, Cerberus, that she was now fixing. The Serpent's Coil wasn't just something she designed. It was named after her first solo mission, Operation Ouroboros. The file contained a single, heavily redacted commendation. It described how she, alone and wounded, had held off a vastly superior enemy force for 72 hours, allowing her team to escape an ambush. A team whose unit insignia was worn by Gunny Croft and the other instructors. They were her men. She had saved their lives, and they had never even known her face. They had tried to humiliate their own ghost, their own savior. The final line of the general's message was not an order, but a stark piece of advice. "Colonel, you do not have an observer in your camp. You have a standard. She is the living embodiment of the program. Your job is not to manage her. It is to watch her, listen to her, and learn from her. Try not to get in her way again." Madsen slowly lifted his head, his eyes moving from the glowing screen to the woman across the room. She was calmly soldering a new connection, her focus absolute, a silent master tuning her instrument. He wasn't looking at a liaison. He was looking at a legend who had walked back from the dead to inspect her life's work. With a final quiet click, Alara finished. The bank of monitors for the Cerberus system flickered once, then burst to life, bathing the room in a steady green glow. System status optimal. The network was not only restored, the diagnostics showed it was running 20% more efficiently. She had streamlined the code, patched the vulnerability, and reinforced the firewalls, all in under an hour. She wiped her hands on a cloth, packed her small toolkit, and turned to leave, her work done. The room was silent, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was not the silence of shock, but of reverence. As she walked toward the exit, one of the young tech officers, who had earlier scoffed at the idea of a woman fixing the system, pushed his chair back and rose to his feet. He snapped to the position of attention, his eyes locked forward. A moment later, the officer next to him stood, then another and another, until every single person in the command center was on their feet, standing in silent, rigid tribute. It was a spontaneous, uncoerced wave of respect. Alara didn't pause. She didn't acknowledge them. She simply walked through the human corridor they had formed. At the door, Colonel Madsen blocked her path. He looked at her, his face stripped of all authority, leaving only a profound, humbled awe. He didn't offer a handshake or words of apology. They would have been inadequate. Instead, he drew himself up to his full height, his back ramrod straight, and rendered the sharpest, most precise salute he had ever given in his 30-year career. It was a gesture of ultimate respect, an admission of his own blindness, and an apology from one warrior to another. Alara stopped. She met his gaze, and for the first time, a flicker of something moved in her eyes. Not forgiveness, but understanding. She gave him a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was enough. Then she walked out of the command center and into the first light of dawn. The sun climbed over the jagged peaks of the desert mountains, casting long shadows across the base. Alara walked away from the sterile concrete of the command complex, the hum of the perfectly functioning system she had built, then saved, fading behind her. She headed toward the empty expanse of the training grounds. She paused at the edge of the serpent's coil. The mud, churned and violated the day before, was now catching the clean morning light, its surface glistening like dark, wet silk. She looked down at her wrist, pushing back the sleeve of her shirt to reveal the faint, silvery tattoo of the Ouroboros. The serpent eating its own tail. A cycle complete. She had come back to the beginning, to the place of her own making, to find it poisoned by the very pride she had designed it to strip away. She had returned not for revenge, but for correction. Her intervention was a silent audit, a violent but necessary recalibration of a system that had forgotten its purpose. Her legacy was not in the files or the commendations, but in the standard she embodied, a standard of quiet competence, of strength without ego, of sacrifice without recognition. The base was quiet now. The arrogance had been silenced. The men who remained would be better warriors for it, forged not just by fire and mud, but by the humbling presence of ghosts who had walked among them. She turned and walked on, a solitary figure moving toward the horizon, leaving behind nothing but a lingering sense of awe and the silent, enduring strength of her example. Her victory was not in the fight, but in the silence that followed.